Um, Cody, it's good to see you.
Hey, man.
I think it has been my task to introduce you. I have known Cody for 15 years when he started on the Obama campaign in Chicago as an intern, came to the White House, quickly rose up to be one of Barack Obama's two chief speechwriters over his 8 years. He has written an amazing book. He is now, you still write speeches, but I think more importantly and passionately for you, you now teach political speechwriting at Northwestern University. Cody is one of the greatest writers of his generation. He has written an incredible book. It is a book that has made me feel more nostalgic for my time in the Obama White House than anything that has happened since the day I left in 2015. So it's good to see you.
It's good to see you.
In
Thanks
person,
for doing this.
actually.
Yeah.
Only our second time in person since the pandemic. So it's great. So let's start with the big picture here. You were in the White House for all 8 years. You saw incredible days like the passage of the Affordable Care Act, some of the hardest times like the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary, the Bin Laden raid, re-election, all of these things. Like there are no quiet 10-day periods in the White House. Why did you pick these 10 days to focus your book on?
Two reasons. And I'll walk you through the 10 days if you haven't gotten a chance to read it yet. The sheer magnitude of the events that happened in 10 days. I remember telling people when I was thinking about writing this book what had happened, and everybody remembered all of the events, but they were like, my God, I had no idea those were all in the same week. And second is what these events say about America. And the book begins on the day of the white supremacist massacre in Charleston, South Carolina, when a self-radicalized, I hesitate to say kid, young man, went into a prayer group and murdered 8 black parishioners and their black pastor. And, we always kind of jumped into high alert in the White House after a mass shooting. It's just what you do. But this was different. This is one that threatened to tear open some of our oldest wounds and was designed to. The shooter said he wanted to start a race war. And the president's going to have to go out and give a statement the next day, but there was an open question and a lot of heated debate as to whether he was going to give a eulogy this time. He didn't want to, and I didn't want to write one. And kind of some of the main drama over that week was whether or not he was going to do it, and that harkened back to 2013 after Republicans in the Senate blocked to vote on background checks after Newtown, with the parents of the Newtown children looking on from the gallery, and that's about as cynical as I've ever seen him. You were still there. And he said, he came back in from speaking and said, the next time this happens, I don't want to speak. If we're going to decide as a country that we're not going to do anything about this, then I don't want to be part of the cycle every time that just lets people think it's okay to move on. And while all this is happening, we've also been preparing for 2 major Supreme Court decisions on Obamacare and marriage equality. And we don't know which way it's going to go. People had odds on it, sort of, in the White House. Obama was always more confident than everybody else. But it was part of my team's responsibility to craft speeches for every eventuality. So we were actually writing speeches for what happens if the Supreme Court basically tells tens of millions of Americans, working Americans, people working 2 jobs, sorry, you don't get health insurance. This country doesn't have to help you with that. What if it told millions of Americans you can't get married to the person you love just because you're gay, and relegated them to second-class citizens? So in just this span of 10 days, we're dealing with, whether or not we're going to stand up to white supremacy, whether or not we're going to let the Confederate flag keep flying over places where people work, whether or not we're going to take care of our most vulnerable citizens, and whether or not we're going to basically codify bigotry. And it all happened at the same time, and we had to write speeches for all of them.
And well, let me ask this. We'll get back to those 10 days in a second, but one of the things about being a speechwriter is you have to learn the voice of the person you're writing for. So for much of your adult life, you wrote words to sound like Barack Obama. What was the experience of writing words to sound like Cody Keenan?
It was hard. It was hard. It was hard to learn his voice, especially when you're not spending a ton of time with him at first as a junior speechwriter. It just takes time. But it was harder to get rid of his voice. I actually had, at the end of when I was done writing the book, I actually went back and reworked the first couple chapters because by then I think I'd found my own voice, and I kind of put it back in there. I got to be a little more profane than we would be in speeches, but I think I mean, I can be blunter in a way that he couldn't in a lot of ways. There were things that he couldn't do or say as president of the United States that I could in this book.
And what made you want to become a speechwriter to begin with? Was that is that something you always wanted to do? Is it, I often, I worked in communications for a long time, and that is directly tied to the fact of where my college internship was in the communications office. And if I'd been placed in the counsel's office, I'd probably be a lawyer, or might actually be a policy person, put me there, but just where I was. But did you seek out speechwriting?
No, I started in the mailroom in Ted Kennedy's office in the Senate. That was my first job, and reading and routing letters, which totally changed the way I thought about politics. I moved to Washington when the West Wing TV show was at its peak, and that's what you assume it's like.
Was it?
No. It's funny because some of our critics will be like, "Oh, they just think it's like the West Wing." I don't walk into a bar and say, "Well, this doesn't look like Cheers." We knew it wasn't the same thing. But what really broke me from that as a kid was reading letters from people who were not always even asking for help, but just wanted somebody on the other side to know what they were going through and hopefully do something about it. And so I climbed the ranks in Ted Kennedy's office. Ultimately, I was a policy aide, and that's what I thought I wanted to keep doing. What changed my life was the 2004 Democratic Convention was in Boston, Ted Kennedy's hometown, and we all got to go and volunteer at it. We had to take the week off because of the Hatch Act, but our reward was a floor pass for one night of the convention, and mine just happened to be the night that Barack Obama gave the speech that made him famous, and I was hooked. But even then, I didn't know how to break into speechwriting. I hadn't written a speech before. And I started writing some for Ted Kennedy. And then, as it so happened, John Favreau, who was my predecessor, and I shared a mentor in a woman named Stephanie Cutter. And she connected the two of us early in the campaign. And I benefited from John's desperation. He had gone from, writing maybe 1 or 2 speeches a week in the Senate for Obama to 4 a day during the campaign. And he was just desperate for help. And he was like, "Can you write? Good. You work for the Kennedys? Great. When can you start?" And that was it. And I drove out to Chicago.
And then, how do I remember this? You stayed. What month was that when you came? It was early, right? It was like spring of 2007?
Yeah, it was May.
May of 2007, yeah. And the Obama campaign launched in January of 2007 is when we started. And were you hooked immediately? Was it intimidating? Was it?
Both. The first thing I wrote for him was his opening remarks at the NAACP debate. Back when there were still, yeah, of course,
yeah.
Back when there were still 9 candidates, and just to watch him read that, I'm all in. And of course, he edited it and worked on it, but this is the best. But I was still really learning on the fly, and John just happened to be an incredibly gracious mentor. That one of the great things about our campaign is there wasn't any backstabbing. There weren't people trying to get around each other. We were friends. We worked 12-hour days and then went to a bar, and then came back and worked another 12-hour day. And obviously we're still that way, but I was hooked from the start, even though I never met Obama until he was president. First time I met him was in the Oval Office.
Oh, that's right. It was like the first day, right?
Yeah, because he was never in Chicago. He was always campaigning. And I think he was in Chicago 3 times while I was there, and he would address the whole staff and then go into meetings with you and Pluff and Axe and whoever. But the first time I met him was in the Oval Office, which is like terrifying. Complete terror.
I mean, I imagine writing speeches for any president is intimidating and challenging, but Obama, perhaps uniquely, and you write about this in the book, uniquely so because he calls himself a writer. Like, I've heard him talk to novelists and say, writers like us. Like, that's how he thinks himself. He had written at the time, by the time the presidential campaign came, 2 very, very well-regarded books. I mean, Dreams of My Father, the one he wrote when he was younger, is an incredible piece of writing. Talk about the dynamic of writing for a writer, right?
Yeah, he's also on record as saying, "I'm a better speechwriter than my speechwriters." So
is that true? You can say whatever you want now.
Yeah, most of the time when it mattered, it was true. It's terrifying. A lot of this book is therapy. Yeah. Working through the demons of trying to write speeches for Barack Obama, because he He's just smarter. He's a better writer. He's got more life experience. He's definitely better read. But he also had this moral imagination that took speeches to a place I couldn't reach at times. Like, let's be honest, if we were doing a message event on clean energy or something, he'd still work on it, but wouldn't really dive in and we'd be fine. But if it was a speech after a racist slaughter or at the 50th anniversary of Selma or the 50th anniversary of the I Have a Dream speech, that's when we'd really need him to dive in.
That's when he would break out the yellow legal pads, right?
That's when he'd break out the yellow legal pads, yeah.
Talk a little bit about the process that you would like take a big speech. It could be one of the ones in this book or any of the other ones where you knew it mattered and you knew it mattered to him. Like, what was the collaborative process between you and the president?
I write about our best speech in this book as the prologue, and probably the one I failed him most on as the chapter 10. The first was Selma, and I think this was the week you departed, right?
It was the last. It was the weekend.
It was the last speech.
My Friday was the event was on a Saturday. But Friday was my last day of that week.
Yeah, the president.
Noticeably, Obama's best speech was the day after I left. But
well, you were still involved.
Yeah.
But the president was going to speak at the 50th anniversary of the marches from Selma to Montgomery, and you can't really screw that speech up. It's like a speech on D-Day. You're just telling an amazing story about an amazing thing that happened. And the symbolism on its own is pretty solid. A black president going back to commemorate what they did. But that was never enough for him. He wanted to do something bigger in every speech. And I didn't quite know what that was yet. I had some ideas that I'd been playing with for a long time because I had the benefit of knowing this speech was coming for months. So I'd been working on stuff for months. But I got really lucky. 2 days before the speech, Washington shut down for a snowstorm. So all of his meetings were canceled. People were supposed to stay home. So I went to work. Because I knew I could get him all day long. And we passed 5 drafts of the speech back and forth in one day, each getting better than the last. I made this the prologue of the book because that speech ultimately became the best summary of the way he views America, the best distillation. That's what I was looking for, of how he views America and what American exceptionalism really is. And it broadened the aperture of our story with a fuller cast of characters. But the thesis that he added to that speech, and again, this is just one of those things that I couldn't reach, was that Selma was not a clash of armies, but a clash of wills. It was a contest to determine the true meaning of America. And I thought, what a great way to describe our politics. So I borrowed that as the thesis for this book. And the writing of that speech is the prologue. But there are also times when I would try to provoke him with some like political BS nonsense, just to rile him up a little bit and get a great idea out of him. So fortunately, a week before the Selma speech, here comes Rudy Giuliani. And he gives some speech where he's just kind of fumbling around to
as he does. Yes.
Yeah, he was never skilled at going for the base, but he tried. And he kind of gives this fumbling monologue about how Barack Obama isn't really one of us. He doesn't love America like we do. He wasn't brought up like us. And everybody knows what he means. It's not a very subtle dog whistle. So I asked Obama if he'd heard about it. And he just goes, he laughed and said, who the F cares what Rudy Giuliani has to say? But then he took the bait and he said, but it does bring up something worth taking on. And that is, who gets to decide what it means to be an American? Who gets to decide, who's the arbiter of what real America is? And he's like, enough with Sarah Palin and flag pins and bald eagles everywhere. Like that's part of America. But there are lots of other real Americas out there that are very different. And I'd argue people that see America like you and I do are only going to grow. So let's make this a speech that gives this generation its marching orders to create a better America.
This book is incredibly optimistic. It's a distillation of an America that Barack Obama believes in. It's a distillation of America that elected Barack Obama twice by quite large margins. Like in reading this book, which I just can't tell you how beautifully written it is, but it can feel like a time machine to a different time. How do you square that 10-day period that you write about, what it said about America, with an America where Donald Trump has been elected, where we're dealing with any number of authoritarian, ethno-nationalist, all of the sort of things that have people feeling that we did not continue on the trajectory we were after Barack Obama was reelected in 2012.
Yeah, and we didn't. And Obama always described America as, if you kind of widen the aperture to look at our entire history as a whole, it's undeniable that the trajectory is positive and going up and constantly getting better. If you look at it little by little, there are plenty of times when we're backsliding. The story of America is a story of bursts of progress and backlash to that progress. I can't tell you how many times he said, for every 2 steps forward, sometimes we take 1 or more steps back. And I don't see any conflict between optimism and realism. I never have, because I'm also very honest in this book about what working in the White House is like. And for the 2,922 days we were there, a lot of times we just go home at night happy if we move the ball forward just a little bit. But it is all of those hundreds and thousands of days that get you the touchdown. You don't win middling victories a lot of the time. When you get those big victories, it's all of those days together. And the big victories in this book don't belong to Barack Obama. He was the one who pushed hard for Obamacare, but that was also the result of a 100-year movement for universal health care. And we're still not there, but he got us closer than we've ever been. And marriage equality was a result of a 50-year movement launched right here in town, where people bled just like people bled in Selma to get that right. And they ultimately did. And we're 400 years into a civil rights movement, and 2 really amazing gun safety movements came out of that 10 days, Every Town and Mom's Demand. So the whole purpose of the book is that this is just 10 days in this broader continuum of democracy. And we're living through the backlash to these 10 days right now. We're living through the backlash to who Barack Obama was. But I am still hopeful that he came a little early in some ways, and that he accelerated where we're going. I am nervous, of course, about the midterms. You talk about this every day for a living. Like, Republicans right now are trying to rig the game so that it's impossible to come back. And that's a very dangerous thing. But I am still hopeful. I think a lot about what Michelle Obama said a few weeks ago at the portrait unveiling. She said, someone like me wasn't supposed to be here. A little girl like me wasn't supposed to be here. But then I started wondering, and these are still her words, who decides what supposed to means? Well, we do. And people ask me a lot about Obama's legacy and what it is. And it's not any certain bill. And it's not even just being a Black first family that carried itself beyond reproach while a generation of kids watched. It is the people who run for office now that are inspired by them. It's what young people do. Same as the Kennedy administration. There was this burst of activity in public service here and especially abroad. And I think we are in the early stages of a whole bunch of people running for office who aren't supposed to be running for office. And I think that's going to change this country in profound ways. So that's what still makes me hopeful.
You are very honest in the book about the challenges of working in the White House. That, as you say, it's sort of therapy for the challenge of writing for Barack Obama.
I got a lot out here.
Yeah, you did. It's good. I'm glad. Did you feel unburdened?
Yeah, a bit. Yeah.
But it's also, I think, a very I'd say this to people who want to read the book. It is the best book to read to know what it's really like to work in the White House. It's not The West Wing. It's not Veep. Thank God. It's not House of Cards or anything else. Like, this is, and it's not. A lot of White House memoirs are very self-aggrandizing. This is like what it's like to be a person who starts at a junior speechwriter, as you say, which is still like a significant position in the White House. It wasn't like you were getting coffee, unless John Pfeiffer was a worse boss than I thought.
He made Lovett get him coffee.
Yeah, that's right. That was a mistake. But it, it's a real honest view of it. But I, for all of the challenges you talk about in there, it's a very romantic view, very romantic rendering of our time there. Like, you clearly loved it. It meant a lot to you. How much do you miss it?
That's a good question. I miss it a lot. I miss the people most of all. I don't miss the hours. I don't miss the self-loathing that comes with trying to crack the code on a speech. I miss the people, and you can't necessarily recreate that. I mean, all of this answer is going to sound like I'm being a massive Kool-Aid drinker, but like,
that's okay.
The fact that we had that bond from the campaign, and more of us stayed for 8 years than any other White House, says a lot. You met your wife in the
Mhm.
White House. I met my wife in the White House. A whole bunch of people met in Iowa and got
Yeah.
married, and in the States and got married. I saw the president a few weeks ago and said, you've got dozens of little grandbabies running around this country.
Yeah.
That's because of you, which he's very, very proud of.
Yes, although he does not hesitate to point out that not a single one of his thousands of staff who've had tens of thousands of babies have named one of them Barack.
That's true. He's very
Yes.
sensitive about
Yes.
that. Maybe for a middle name on my next one, we'll see.
That's right.
But I want young people to read this book. I want my students my students have to read this book because it's on the syllabus. But
Smart. Yes.
I want young people to read this book, and I want it to do for them what other books did for me, which is convince them that politics is worth their time and effort and energy. It's a worthy vessel to pour themselves in, because we are just fed a steady diet of cynicism all the time, and the media does it too. Everybody's in it for themselves. Washington is broken. Nothing gets done. It's not really true. There are lots of people working really hard all day long that change the country in small and profound ways every day. And you don't even have to be in the White House. It's advocates and organizers, and it's just, you can change things, but change is also not permanent. You have to keep fighting for it. The Supreme Court's looking at marriage equality, for crying out loud, which is not something I would have imagined 7 years ago. So you just have to keep at it, as frustrating as it can be. So I'm very clear about all of the things that were frustrating, and there were many. But there were some pretty wonderful things about it.
I remember President Obama saying to us right after the re-election that we will never have a time in our lives we'll have it more of an opportunity to do more good for more people than right now. And
Mhm.
so for all in those, especially those first couple years, like your book actually talks almost, this was a turning point in the administration after a couple of tough years right after he was reelected. Then it sort of moved in a better direction, but those first years were hard. But that was the truth. Is like that's what bonded everyone to do, because almost everyone there could leave and go do other things that were easier or maybe more lucrative. But this was the chance, a group of people doing the best job they could under incredibly challenging circumstances, serving someone that they all believed in, was a very special thing. And it's not a thing that can be recreated necessarily for us, but it is happening for other people, like right now in the Biden White House
Mhm.
or in other White Houses to come.
Yeah, it doesn't get better than that. It's sometimes lightning strikes, but that can happen on any campaign. I almost push my students into campaigns. I say, just do it. Even if you lose, you were going to learn so much. And a campaign is a great way to have like 7 different jobs in 1 year. If you're good at what you're doing, if you're the best photocopier, someone's going to grab you and make you a field organizer. If you're the best field organizer, someone's going to grab you and you're going to run a county. And it's just, there's no better way to bond with people when you're already broke anyway as a young person, and just have tons and tons of fun.
One of the things that you talk a lot about when you write about the Selma speech, but I think is one of the real themes of Barack Obama's speeches over the years, is the beginning with that speech you saw on the floor of the convention in Boston, is a tremendous amount of patriotism. We probably never had a president who spoke more profoundly about patriotism, but from the perspective of a black man in America. Can you talk a little bit about how Barack Obama sort of squared the circle between his belief in American exceptionalism and all of the cruelties and injustice in our past and continuing in our presence?
Yeah, I'd argue no president's talked more openly about faith too, and both of those statements drive conservatives nuts. But he saw, I think, I can't speak for Black Americans, but I think Black Americans have a much different view of democracy than we do, because they have had to make it real. Their struggles have had to make it real. The marchers in Selma who got their heads cracked in brought us closer to a full democracy. And just by virtue of having lived that experience, I think Barack Obama saw it that way. And, we all know this sort of basic description of American exceptionalism on the right, which is that just we were made perfect, love it or leave it. And that's not true. We were made imperfect, and it says so in the founding documents. In order to form a more perfect union, that was our challenge. And it's not like the founders were all that perfect either. It was a country for white men. But over time, we have gradually, each generation, and this is where I don't know where Barack Obama and I start or end anymore, because I've just fully adopted his worldview. And it's just generations of Americans have fought and bled to bring us closer to those ideals, even though we're still not there. But each generation we do get a little bit closer. And that's what makes America exceptional, is that we are, and this is all from the Selma speech too, we are not of any certain birthright or bloodline or faith or creed or color. We're this beautiful mess that can work together and change for the better in a way that a lot of older societies can't. And if we don't, one thing that Democrats have to prove is that we can make this beautiful mess work, because the alternative is autocracy, and that's no fun. That's bad for everybody. And so that's his vision of American exceptionalism, is that America is great because America can change. And he took a lot of his inspiration from the civil rights movement, even though he was just a baby, and living in Hawaii. He wasn't of it. But he learned from it, and that kind of became his moral underpinning.
Yeah, there's nothing more patriotic than trying to improve your country.
Yeah. That was part of his rant after the Rudy Giuliani thing. He said, don't tell me about real America. What could possibly be more patriotic than getting your head cracked in while marching for the right to vote?
Barack Obama, obviously, I think, a uniquely talented communicator, both as a speechwriter, speech giver. When you look at the Democratic Party right now, how do you feel about the story they're telling? Are there lessons to learn from President Obama, from the speeches in this book?
Yeah.
I was kind of just like throwing up the alley.
I know. I'm just going to get in trouble. There are some talented.
There's no bad press, so go for it.
There are some talented communicators in the party. There are some also very untalented communicators in the party. And I think a couple of the places that we have lost our way as Democrats, one is easy. We should be the party of people's economic concerns. I mean, that's just low-hanging fruit. We should be the party of working people. And we can't just demand that because all of our policies are the right ones. We don't talk to them anymore. When was the last time you heard a politician talk about essential workers? Their jobs are still just as essential. Barack Obama won the white working class vote in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania twice as a black man. He won Indiana and North Carolina for the first time any Democrat had in 40-something years. And that's because he didn't do what a lot of Democrats are doing right now, which is scolding people, which is calling people racist, which is just saying you are wrong and therefore I'm going to cancel you. That can be satisfying, but it gets you nothing. It's not going to turn somebody around. It's not going to change somebody's mind. It's not going to win their vote. I've always said that Barack Obama practiced a politics of redemption rather than recrimination. And by that, I mean, partially he had to do that as a black man running for president in America, but he did not point out our historical faults and say, you're to blame, and there's nothing we can do about it. He did not scold people for having other ideas. He always gave people the chance to change. That's the way he spoke on the campaign trail. He never would have said something like the deplorables comment. He said something in Selma. He wrote this beautiful line saying, what a wonderful thing it would be if the South could rise again, not by reasserting the past, but by transcending it. He rewrote the back half of the Charleston speech around the lyrics to Amazing Grace, which was written by a slave owner who'd changed his mind. And he flat out gave people the chance to change their mind by saying, perhaps we've been blind to the unique mayhem that gun violence inflicts on our communities. Maybe we see that now. And of course we hadn't been blind. We'd written 13 eulogies before that. But it gives people the chance to change after something horrible happened rather than just say, this is your fault. He said, perhaps we've been blind to the way racism continues to infect every segment of our society. Perhaps we've been blind to the pain the Confederate flag stirs in our citizens. And I print in this book some of the letters that he got from people after that speech. And some of them are really, really remarkable, from a person who flat out says, I've been racist and I didn't even know it. And I'm going to change. It's when you write a speech, you hope at your best you can change somebody's mind. And then you get a letter like that. It's pretty staggering. Now, of course, a speech isn't going to change everybody's mind, because we're still living through some pretty nasty stuff right now. And if people ask all the time, do speeches still matter? Do a president's words still matter? Just look at the Trump administration. He unleashed some pretty nasty stuff. You had people marching in Charlottesville without their hoods on. You have actual Republican politicians now openly promising violence in the streets if they don't get their way. This is he unscrewed some steam valve, and it's going to be hard to mix my metaphors to put the genie back in the bottle.
One of the, as you mentioned earlier, one of the dramas that go throughout this book is whether Barack Obama is going to end up giving the eulogy in Charleston. He ends up giving, as you said, this very, very powerful speech. But the moment that a lot of people remember from that speech is not the words you wrote, sorry,
Okay.
or the speech he gave. It is the decision to sing Amazing Grace. You talk a little bit about how that happened and what your reaction was when they started building out the bars there.
Yeah. Well, it was all my idea, and I wrote, "Sir, sing here."
Yes,
smart. No,
smart.
that is not true. That is not true. I failed him on this speech. It was a real. It's a journey in this book. One of my favorite passages describing what an all-nighter in the West Wing is like, because the West Wing is a weird place after midnight. There was some spooky stuff going on in there. But between the speeches we were working on for Obamacare and marriage equality and this, I was just tapped out. And we had a pretty passionate debate in the Oval Office that Monday. This was 5 days after the shootings. Obama didn't want to give a eulogy. I didn't want to write a eulogy. Valerie Jarrett was pushing pretty hard for it, and Josh Earnest was in there too. And one of the amazing things about Josh is he always diffuses any tense situation in a way. He was like the Coach Taylor of the White House. If anybody watched Friday Night Lights, he makes you want to be better. And we were going back and forth on whether to give a speech, and Josh jumped in and said, "Listen, if you do speak, and I'm not advocating for it, you could talk about what those families did by forgiving the killer. That's pretty powerful." And Josh was a man of deep faith. He just never wore it on his sleeve. Some of the best edits I ever got to speeches were Josh and Dennis McDonough would actually suggest passages that would resonate with people of faith, and that wasn't something that naturally occurred to me. And that caught the president. He had just gone on a rant about the Confederate flag, but after Josh brought up the grace, the president sort of came around and thought, "All right, listen, I still haven't decided if I want to speak, but if I do, it's going to be about grace."
And that's when you knew he had decided to speak.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's like that's a done deal. So I was still trying to get a little bit more out of him, but he had nothing to offer. He said, talk about race, talk about guns, talk about the Confederate flag, but wrap it all up in grace. And I'm just like, what? I have nothing to go on.
Yes.
And I was he's talked about this too. He did that podcast with Bruce Springsteen. And he talked about this, and he admitted he didn't give me anything to go on. He also admitted I didn't give him anything good in return. But I kind of freaked out.
How unnecessary is that? Just to
I know. Well, he's
to Bruce Springsteen of all people.
He's
right?
a better speechwriter than the speechwriters.
Yeah.
But I struggled through it for 3 days and gave him a draft on Thursday night, knowing it wasn't great. And he called me back to the White House that night at 11 o'clock. And what I had done over the course of 3 days, he rewrote over the course of 3 hours. And he left the first 2 pages largely intact, lots of edits, more than usual, and just drew one big line through pages 3 and 4, which is I hadn't slept in like 3 days. And I'm just staring at it like, what? And then he walked me through what he'd written, which was beautiful. And I apologized to him, which I'd never done before. I said, "I'm sorry that I couldn't get it there." And this is another reason why he was such a good boss. He could have just told me to get lost. Even worse, he could have just given his draft to somebody else and excised me from the equation entirely. But instead, he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Brother, we're collaborators. You gave me what I needed to work with here. You'll recognize some of your work in what I rewrote. And when you've been thinking about these issues for 40 years, you'll know what you want to say too." And just that little act of grace goes a really long way. So rather than leave there feeling bad about myself, I was energized because I had to go work on the speech for 3 more hours. And then the next morning, he went out and spoke on marriage equality in a really beautiful speech that was drafted by a woman on our team named Sarah Perry. And he ad-libbed a bit at the end too, which was kind of beautiful stuff about how, again, this was the result of years of not just activists and advocates, but a million little moments where people came out to their parents and their parents accepted them. And a country came around to learn that love is love. And it was beautiful. And then 5 minutes after that, the helicopter lands on the South Lawn and we climb aboard to fly to Andrews. And he's already back into the eulogy, working on the eulogy. And when we landed at Andrews, he stood up and gave me the pages and said, if it feels right, I might sing it, which I had not thought of. It hadn't occurred to me. And I just looked up at him, and I usually, I think you're this way too. Usually we're a little more risk averse, and we're looking for reasons to tell Obama why he shouldn't do something. And in this case, our hearts were all kind of full that morning because a bunch of our colleagues, we're like literally people we work with every single day. We're just told what they should have had all along, the rights they should have had all along. You can get married, and that now we couldn't be happy about that. So I just looked at him. I was like, "You do you, man." and he ultimately, when you see an AME church service, you know what it's like. He's going to sing about 2 minutes into it, and it was just a pretty remarkable moment.
There's always this moment where he's decided, like, and there's no, like, I know that look. I wasn't there that day, but I know that look in his eye where it's like, my decision is made. You can say something, but my decision is made.
What's even worse is when the decision's made, and he still forces you to make the opposing argument.
Yes, always.
Just for no reason other than to embarrass you.
Yes. When you talk about the president as he referred to as a collaborator, and in the book you write about how he often gives you advice on where to seek inspiration when you are stuck, and things to read and things to listen to. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, all the time. Even going back to the campaign, when in September, this is 6 weeks until election day, the bottom falls out of the economy. To his credit, he called us all immediately and said, read some FDR, see what FDR said when the country was as scared as this. But I think more specifically, he oddly used jazz to give me advice. When we were working on that speech on the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, in which you're just set up to fail. We need you to go to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and give a speech 50 years to the day after the I Have a Dream speech. Cool. And he had no interest in working on it.
It was one of the first big speeches you did as chief speechwriter.
He had no interest in working on it, just gave me nothing and said, all right, look, read James Baldwin if you're stuck. Listen to John Coltrane if you're not. And I was like, what does that mean? How does that help me? And it didn't, but I mean a little bit because I hadn't read much Baldwin. He gave me a copy of The Fire Next Time, and reading Baldwin is like a hot knife through butter. It's just searing moral clarity that inspires you to write what's true and what's right and what's wrong, and to delineate between those two things. Whereas Coltrane, I listened to it a little bit, not a lot. It was just the freeform jazz kind of loosens you up a little bit. The Miles Davis story is what I've told a lot on tour, but this was the 2015 State of the Union address, which is a miserable speech, mostly for the audience. But as a speechwriter, it's the speech you long to write, right? Then you
is that
finally
the Corey Remsburg?
Yes, I think it was the Corey Remsburg one.
Yeah.
It was Corey Remsburg and Rebecca Erler.
Yeah.
And so I'd written this speech, and I got it as tight and as lyrical as we had ever gotten one of these. Rather than go through a whole list of people in the First Lady's box, I built the entire domestic policy section around this one amazing woman who wrote us a letter from Minneapolis that Hallie found.
I still remember a line from that speech.
Yeah.
To be young and love in America, what could be better than that?
Well, that's where I like to add a little flair. Yeah. And I was close to proposing to my wife at that point, so I was just feeling very romantic. So he called me up to the Oval Office to talk about it, and we're about 8 days out, and he said, look, I think we're in the best shape we've ever been on this speech this far out. And I was like, oh, thank God. And then he goes, but, and you're like, oh. And he said, but we have a week to go, so we can make it better. And I'm just dreading having to rewrite an 8,000 word speech. And he goes, here's the thing. Every line says something. Every word means something. Everything in this speech is at a 10. There's nowhere to breathe. There's no quiet moments. There's no emotional moments. And then he says, do you listen to Miles Davis? And I say, no. And he goes, well, you know what they say about Miles Davis? He always asks questions like this, too, where he knows you don't know the answer, or he knows you do. He'll be like, you know what they say about the Chicago Bears defense? I'm like, yes, I watched the game. But he'll be like, you know what they say about Miles Davis? And I go, again, no. And he says, it's the silences. It's the notes you don't play. It's the space between. And I need that in this speech. I need some quiet moments and some silences, because they can say a lot, too. So I want you to go home tonight and pour yourself a drink and listen to some Miles Davis. Don't do any work, but come back here tomorrow and find me some silences. And I got it. I think that's when I came up with that line, that they were young and love in America, and it doesn't get much better than that. That's not the typical line in a State of the Union address, but it was nice.
I think in a minute we're going to take some questions from the audience, and there'll be you can raise your hand and there'll be someone who brings the mic around. But before we get to that, you now, and I know from talking to you all the time that you're very passionate about this, is you now teach young writers at your alma mater, Northwestern University. What do you tell them? Like, what's the advice, like the short synopsis of the advice you give someone who wants a career in speechwriting?
It's very hard to break into. There's a catch-22 built in. If you're trying to get a speechwriting job, they want to see what speeches you've written. But how can I have written any speeches if nobody will give me a speechwriting job? So that's why I teach. I'm giving my kids the cheat codes. They get to graduate with 10 speeches in a portfolio to show somebody. But you have to write your brains out, as often as you can on as many different topics as you can. Keep a journal. There's a cool app I use that syncs across all my devices with a writing prompt every day. You can find out, professors give speeches, deans give speeches, write op-eds for the school paper because those are just mini speeches. But get into it and read widely too, because nobody is the font of all good ideas. I would get ideas from everywhere, even ones that would change my mind in the way I talked on things or wrote on things. So it's really just dive in. One of my students are always so concerned, and I'm trying to break them of this, that their very first job will determine their entire career trajectory. And it's just not true. My first job was opening letters in a mailroom. And
I mean, which did lead to you working for Barack Obama.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah,
but that's the exception, not the rule, is what you're saying.
It doesn't dictate it.
Yeah.
You're going to bounce around to a bunch of different jobs. You're going to work on losing campaigns. You worked on losing
Oh
campaigns.
my God, so many.
You almost quit politics, right?
Like several times, yeah.
Yeah, and look at you now.
Yeah, I quit politics. Finally, thank you, Barack Obama.
Yeah, but you almost quit politics before you joined the Obama campaign.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine. So again, I remind them this is, and I'm very strict on day one because there's usually a wait list. And I say, look, if you don't want to be a speechwriter, don't take this class because I am going to push you. I'm going to make you think differently. I'm going to make you write differently. I'm going to make you use different muscles. And above all, I'm going to push you really hard to go into public service. And I was nervous when I first taught this class that it wouldn't work. But then my best student became not just the chief speechwriter for the governor of Illinois at 22, but he liked her so much that she was his only speechwriter for 3 years. And now she's a law student at NYU just down the street. So she babysits my daughter, which has nothing to do with the performance in class or in politics,
Yes.
but it's nice. But to have a bunch of students sprinkled throughout mayor's office and state houses and the Biden administration is my proof that it works. And eventually I'm going to have like this whole little mafia of speechwriters throughout politics that are beholden to me.
Let's think of all the babysitting opportunities.
Yeah.
All right, let's take some questions from the audience. Raise your hand. There we go, and someone's going to bring a mic to you.
I was wondering what your thoughts were on dealing in speeches with people on the other side of the aisle, or if it's international affairs, somebody maybe adverse, and the balance between demonization and kind of working contrast versus kind of building a bridge and understanding, and kind of how you balance that in speech writing. So with thoughts, with President Trump and how how various Democrats have dealt with him in terms of either kind of building a picture of how to deal with him versus kind of more the kind of contrast.
It's the easiest thing in the world to demonize somebody. You don't even have to put thought into it. It's much, much harder to do the opposite. And Obama made that easy for us because that was his default setting. On the international stage, he flat out said in his inaugural address, he addressed the Muslim world at his inauguration, said, if you, if you unclench your fist, we'll open our hands if you unclench your fist or something, and then went and gave a big speech to the Muslim world just 6 months later. That was a big step that an American president hadn't done before. On the campaign trail, sometimes we would get a little over our skis as speechwriters because we're young progressives. And, I remember in 2012, he would take a lot of lines early on. I learned quickly not to do it, but he would take a lot of lines out of our campaign speeches against Mitt Romney and be like, we don't need to say that about the guy. You don't need to demonize the guy. His policies are worth, junking, but not him. I think the best way to deal with Trump, and I think you guys have talked about that on the pod, is through humor. Taking him down a peg. He's just ripe for comedy. Now, of course, you can blame the Obama speechwriters for making him run in the first place by roasting him at that dinner. But if I could do it again, I would have gone harder.
Who else do we have in the front row?
You mentioned a speech changing a mind is the best outcome, but the very least thing that it has to do is keep attention of an audience for a long amount of time.
Yeah.
And you're not there giving the speech. You can have a speaker that's going to either give it really well or really poorly, but you control the words. What kinds of things have you leveraged or patterns or concepts that you've leveraged to like keep attention for difficult topics or boring topics and still keep the audience engaged and with
The cardinal rule of speeches like that is one that Barack Obama broke every single day, and it's to keep it short. He believed that if he could just made every single argument, he could eventually win people over, and that's an admirable quality. He was just better at holding people's attention than most politicians. Most other politicians, you don't want to go sit through a 45 minute to an hour long speech. He could pull it off. Nobody else can. JFK, this could be apocryphal. I've never proven it, but allegedly JFK once said, keep all speeches to 12 minutes or less, because after that, people just start thinking about food or sex. But there's so many ways to do it. I teach my students, every speech should tell a story from beginning to end. And if you're good enough, your entire series of speeches over an administration should tell a story from beginning to end. But you can also sprinkle stories into a speech, make people feel something, make people laugh, include jokes. People do not politics has become so humorless. It's killing me. You can have fun and be funny, even if you're talking about something that's pretty complicated. And then the last one's kind of technical. You should, because always remember, you're writing for an audience. If you're writing for the ear, not the eye, people can't read this. So sprinkle in what I call signposts. You don't be afraid to just say, I'm going to talk about 4 things today. First, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so that was the first thing. Second, blah, 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 blah. It sounds kind of silly, but it's really helpful to the audience to know where you're going in a speech.
It's also very Barack Obama with his very linear mind.
Yes.
3 things. Yes.
So that's the third thing I wanted to talk about today. Point number 4.
Right there.
Hi there. First of all, thank you so much for coming and thank you for being so inspiring. I particularly loved what you said about combating cynicism. There are so many doomers out there, so many pessimists. What we hear most of the time is pessimistic. And I feel like pessimism, it's easy to be pessimistic. It's much harder to be optimistic. And you can also create self-fulfilling prophecies, right? If you believe that things are going to get worse, then you will pretty much guarantee that things will get worse. So I totally agree with you about always dreaming big and staying positive and making America, the way that we want it to be. I wanted to ask you, I personally love speechwriting and crafting messages. It's my dream to become a public diplomacy officer for the State Department.
Cool.
And I wanted to know if you ever were involved in creating speeches on issues of international affairs and maybe how that differed from writing speeches on domestic issues.
Yeah, I did a bunch. It wasn't my wheelhouse. Ben Rhodes and Terry Zuplatt usually did that, but I wrote several. And being a White House speechwriter is you often just get to cheat because we had full access to the State Department. We would talk to the consulate on the ground everywhere we were going and ask them for not just a briefing on what's going on in the country, but who are some of their most favorite poets? Who are their best singers? Give us some great lines that will immediately engage the audience off the bat. There's this hilarious video that our White House actually put out on YouTube of Barack Obama butchering foreign languages in other countries, where his opening line would just be like, "Hey, how you doing?" in some other language, and he would just ruin the pronunciation every time. It's really funny, but the audiences would eat it up. When it gets to the more complicated policy parts, obviously you've got, and this part I stayed way away from. I made Rhodes handle it, but then you have to have meetings with 20 officials, and it's all very, very important and serious, and it gets they go over it with a fine-tooth comb to make sure you don't say anything that's even remotely off message or off script. But the more fun parts of those speeches are when you can move a foreign audience. The when Obama speaks in India, 1 billion people are watching. The when Obama speaks in Havana, Cuba, the entire world is watching. Those are really, really fun speeches, and you can use them to drive home a point too. You don't. It's not that you want to be rude on foreign soil, but you also want to stand up for American values. And when we went to Jamaica, we ended the speech with a story of a gay organizer in Jamaica, and their culture is still pretty anti-gay down there. and that was a very powerful thing for him to do. And we heard from a lot of Jamaicans after that. To get to your first point about cynicism, my favorite line on this comes from John Lovett, and I can't remember the exact words, but he said something once. It is not somehow cooler to be cynical and pleasantly surprised when people prove you right than it is to be hopeful and optimistic, and be disappointed when people let you down. Because you'll get let down a lot if you're hopeful and optimistic. If you're cynical, first of all, you're not going to do anything. You're never going to get anything done. And so what? You get proven right when somebody lets you down. Big deal. To be hopeful and actually rewarded, to have your faith rewarded, is a much more exciting prospect.
Here in the front row. Let's come this way.
Hi. I have two questions, but the first one is you mentioned one speech about same-sex marriage. One of the things I really respect about Barack Obama is that, and he's managed as a politician to do this and have people buy into it, that he changes his mind, and that evolution and growth. And you also referenced about a mistake that Democrats make now is this canceling. That like if you used to believe, I'll give you an example. In San Francisco, we had a big controversy over the renaming of the schools here, public schools, and including a school named after Abraham Lincoln, and another one named after, I forget his first name, Lowell. He was an abolitionist. And the argument there was that before he was an abolitionist, he wasn't against slavery. And I always refer to Barack Obama. I was like, I wonder if they would name a school after Barack Obama, because he had an evolution with same-sex marriage. And I'm just wondering, I feel like I remember a speech, or it was a conversation where he talked a little bit about that evolution. I was just wondering if you can give any insight into that.
It might have been the Robin Roberts interview. I'm not sure where he talked about it, but it's the same evolution my father went through and a lot of other grown-ups, which is that times change. And, I think in the last century, not as many people were out as they are now, right? Remember Ellen started this huge major thing, but Harvey Milk started it here way earlier than that. And when more and more people came out and their parents and family members realized, oh, well, it's still my kid. It's fine. You just change with them, That's an easy thing to change your mind on, whether you're still going to love your kid or not. And I think he just saw, as his daughters grew up, there's this whole generation where it's just a given. So, yeah, I've never understood why it's considered a personality flaw to change your mind on something. I think it's actually a strength to admit that you were wrong and to change for the better. People ask a lot if I've ever disagreed with Obama on something, and fortunately, hardly ever. I mean, that's one reason why we were lucky to work for him. It's nice to work for somebody you agree with most of the time, but that's one of them. I wish he'd come out sooner, but he got there just like a lot of other people. Yeah.
Here we go, right here.
And on the canceling thing, I tell my students, I'm like, look, it doesn't achieve anything. What I want you to do is, if somebody, says something repugnant or has just this horrific idea, beat it with your own. That's why I'm teaching you to write. That's what democracy is all about. It's a much better way to take somebody down, to just make them look like a fool by taking their argument apart and making a better one. It's harder, but I think it's longer lasting.
Having written for the president for 8 years, kind of the pinnacle, could you ever see yourself working for another administration or campaign? And if so, what would it take to motivate you to do that?
I mean, maybe. It depends on the person and the time. It's a hard thing to say no to if somebody asks, but I have a baby now, and it's just
named Grace.
Grace. And they were born at the same time. It's just, it's a difficult enough job on its own. I mean, I slept there sometimes when I was struggling on the speech, and we were just there at all hours. And even when you're at home, you're not off duty. You're tethered to your email, and it just ruins weekends and weddings. And I don't mean to sound like I'm complaining, because it's the greatest job in the world, but it's very difficult to have a family. And that's one of the reasons why my wife and I waited. But I had my time, I think, and that's why I enjoy teaching other people, to prepare them to go in and do it instead, and hopefully do it even better. And I would rather just be a dad.
Over here on this side.
I'm not sure the question that's behind it, but obviously with Ukraine and China and Taiwan and all those sorts of things, how would the conversation, and we've been talking about kind of making this country a better country, and of course, free speech democracy is one of the fundamental differences between us and them. How would things be different in the administration with Obama confronting those threats while still trying to make this a better country without undermining our security, like free exchange with China? Should we limit technology? I've heard don't let the college students come here from China anymore because they're a threat. So I'm not sure the question behind this, but do you have a sense for how things might be different had you been confronting those sorts of issues when Obama was running the
We did grapple with all these same issues. I mean, Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. We were always kind of at odds with China on various things. Bad things happened all the time, and it's just part of the job to deal with it. It's kind of impossible to answer what it would be like now, because now, in many ways, is a result of the Trump years in the world and kind of the abdication of American responsibility and leadership. That's what got us into a lot. That's what empowered a lot of these other leaders to just do what they wanted with abandon. So I don't know if that would be the case had Trump not been president. So it's a difficult question to answer, but and these problems and challenges are difficult too. You know, what do? You marshal the world around some sort of sanctions or punishments on Putin, like we did in 2014. You know, it doesn't necessarily stop him. The world is a tough place.
So we can get time for maybe one or two more right here in the middle.
You talk a lot about, or we hear a lot these days about all this doom and gloom stuff about Ukraine and climate change. How do you stay optimistic? You mentioned you have a daughter. Does that help, or does that hurt?
Having a daughter actually makes it worse, because I am constantly worried about climate change, about guns. I'm just constantly terrified. I think all parents can relate to that. I'm just new to the game. I mean, there are plenty of reasons to be cynical and disappointed. Like, you know, the Dobbs decision's a pretty big one. But there are plenty of reasons to feel good about everyone that's doing. Dan can probably list off hundreds of organizations that are out there fighting every single day, and all sorts of great people running for office, and all sorts of great resources in which to invest your time. So there is enough out there to feel cynical and depressed about. And I don't think don't forget that when Barack Obama first talked about hope in that speech in 2004, people forget the next line, which is that I'm not talking about blind optimism or willful ignorance that things will just get better on their own. Hope is the belief that with action and bringing other people together, you can make things better. And he told us the day after Trump won, he crashed the senior advisors meeting in the morning, and he said, listen, people still mock me for talking about hope, but this is when you need hope the most, when things are dark. You don't need hope when things are going great. You need hope when stuff is tough, and that's what keeps you going, and that's what keeps you fighting.
Last question all the way in the back row there. Sure.
I was wondering, during your time with the Obama administration, if you felt that people were a little bit more polarized around some issues like healthcare, for example, and if you had to factor that into your speeches, like if you adjusted the tone, for example.
What was the last part? Sorry, I just couldn't hear you.
If you had to adjust your tone or the way you approached your speeches based on if you thought people were more polarized around some issues like healthcare, for example.
No, I don't think we were any more polarized in the Obama years than we'd been in the years before that. It was different. A lot of the opposition to him was racially based. You know, the Tea Party didn't come out of nowhere. The birthers didn't come out of nowhere. But if any Democrat tried to take on health insurance, like they had for years, I mean, Bill Clinton tried it in '93, and that was pretty partisan. So we wouldn't modulate for that. He always believed, though, that he could make a logical, reasoned argument that would win anybody over, and he gave it his best in multiple joint sessions and big speeches. But But ultimately, he's the one who pushed Obamacare through against the advice of some people in the inner circle. With what? We got one Republican vote, right? Joe Gow, right?
The first time, but not the second
The first time, but not the second. And then he lost his job for it. And a lot of Democrats lost their jobs for voting for Obamacare. They were voted out. But now 30 million people have health insurance because of it. And that's a pretty significant win in my book.
So, first, Cody, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Afterwards, we are going to gather for a reception where Cody will be signing. You can buy a book. Cody will be signing your books. Can answer some more questions if folks have them. I would, if you have not bought the book, and you're interested in politics and speech writing and want to feel good about America, that is at a premium these days. I just can't recommend this book enough. We also have, I think, right now a special musical performance, and you've all been handed out lyrics. And here we go.
Was grace that taught my heart to feel, and grace my fears relieved. How precious is that grace of His, the hour I first believed. Let's sing it. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved someone like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see.
Thank you so much. Thanks for being here tonight. And we'll see everyone in the lounge afterwards where Cody will be signing books.
Thanks, brother.